Hey, it's Nathan. Before we start, I want you to think about something that sounds boring until it ruins your life. Paperwork. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. A form with a date on it, a signature, a box someone ticked in an office you've never walked into, about a man they've never met. Today's story is about a soldier who spent 4 deployments learning that in most of the world, power isn't held by whoever is loudest or richest. It's held by whoever controls the record, whoever gets to say what happened. He learned that in villages where a single ledger decided who ate and who didn't, and he came home to find the exact same weapon pointed at him from a courthouse in his own hometown, held by the family he married into. They had built a version of him on paper, a confused man, a dangerous man, a stranger. And that paper man walked into court ahead of him and took his house, his pension, and his boys before he ever opened his mouth. What they didn't understand is what he did for a living. He didn't argue with the record. He read it, and then he sat very still for 11 months. Because the thing about a lie written down is that it can't move, it can't apologize, and it can't run when you finally hold it up to the light. Stay with me on this one. The ending is worth it. Beck Rutherford could tell you who owned every roof in a village of 400 people within about 9 days, and he could do it without a single raised voice. That was the job. Officially, he was a 38 Bravo, a civil affairs non-commissioned officer, Master Sergeant, United States Army, and if you asked most people what that meant, they'd guess something about handing out soccer balls. What it actually meant was that when a team went into a district, Beck's small section went in behind the shooting and started asking the questions nobody else had time for. Who does this well belong to? Who signs for the fuel? When the road washed out last spring, who paid to fix it, and who was supposed to? He'd sit for 3 hours drinking tea to get one name. Then he'd write it in a green notebook and go get another one. By the end of a rotation, he'd have a map that didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. Not a map of terrain, a map of obligation. Who owed whom? Who could ruin whom? Where the pressure was already stored, waiting. He had a saying he'd picked up from his father, a machinist named Raymond Rutherford, who had spent 31 years making parts that had to be right to 4 decimal places. Paper outlives people. Raymond said it about work orders and inspection stamps. Beck applied it to whole districts. Bullets end an argument for an afternoon. A ledger ends it for a generation. He was 39 years old, built like a man who had carried things for a living, quiet in a way people sometimes mistook for slowness. He had a habit of waiting a full second before he answered anything, which drove some officers crazy and made every village elder he ever met trust him immediately. He was on his 4th deployment. He had 2 sons, and he had a wife named Shelby, and by the spring of that 4th deployment, he had a marriage that had gone so quiet he'd started counting the days between her replies. They had met in Pemberton, Indiana, which is a town of about 11,000 people arranged around a river, a grain terminal, and a medical office park that had grown, over 20 years, into the biggest employer in the county. That office park was called Clearview Cognitive, and it belonged to Shelby's father. Howard Cavanaugh had started Clearview in a storefront next to a tanning salon in 1998, with 2 exam rooms and a leased scanner he couldn't afford. By the time Beck married his daughter, Clearview had 9 locations across 3 states and a marketing budget that put its name on the local high school scoreboard. Howard was 68, silver, expensively casual, and he had the particular warmth of a man who is generous, the way a landlord is generous. He had built the thing that made everyone in that town solvent, and he expected the town to remember it every single day. Howard had a wife, Gloria, who ran the family's public face and had never once in 11 years said Beck's rank out loud without a small pause before it, like she was translating from a language she found unpleasant. He had a son named Alec, a neuropsychologist, 44, who had gone to a good school and come home to sign his father's paperwork, and had never seemed entirely comfortable in his own skin since. He had a younger son named Todd, 36, whose job title was Director of Provider Relations, which meant he took attorneys golfing, and he had Shelby. Shelby Cavanaugh was 35, sharp, funny when she wanted to be, and had spent her entire adult life in a house where love and leverage were the same substance. Her title at Clearview was Military Liaison. She went to base wellness fairs and veteran resource nights with a folding table and a stack of glossy brochures and a smile that closed rooms. She was good at it, genuinely good at it. Beck had watched her talk a 19-year-old private out of a panic attack in a parking lot once, and he had loved her for it in a way that never quite went away. Even later, even when he understood exactly what she'd been recruiting for. They married 11 years before that fourth deployment. Howard gave a toast at the reception in which he welcomed Beck to the family by saying, with a laugh, that he supposed every family needed somebody who was good with his hands. Everyone laughed. Beck waited his full second, then thanked him, and said his father had been good with his hands too, and had made parts for the landing gear on the aircraft that had flown Howard's own daughter home from college, so he'd take that as high praise. There was a beat of silence at the head table. Gloria's smile went thin. Shelby squeezed his knee under the tablecloth, delighted. That was the marriage at its best. Two people who knew exactly what they'd married into, holding hands under the table. They had Ian a year later, and Adam 4 years after that. Ian was 11 now, watchful, a kid who read manuals for fun. Adam was 7, loud, entirely without fear, the sort of child who introduced himself to strangers in grocery stores. Beck missed a third of their lives. He knew the arithmetic. He kept it in the same notebook where he kept everything else, because he had decided a long time ago that the honest thing to do with a cost was to write it down instead of pretending it wasn't being paid. He deployed the 4th time in March. Shelby drove him to the airfield, and at the gate, she hugged him a little too briefly and said, "Take care of yourself, Beck," in the voice people use at the end of a phone call with a bank. The petition reached him 11 weeks later, in a plywood building with a bad air conditioner, 7,200 miles from Pemberton. It came the way legal paper reaches deployed soldiers, which is badly. Forwarded twice, opened by nobody, dropped on his cot in a manila envelope with a boot print on one corner. Dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Shelby A. Kavanaugh, having resumed her maiden name. Respondent, Beckett A. Rutherford. Requested relief, the marital residence, an order dividing the respondent's military retired pay, and sole legal and physical custody of the 2 minor children, with supervised parenting time at the petitioner's discretion. Beck read it twice. Then he went outside and stood in the heat with his hands on top of his head like a man who had just run a long way, which he had, for 11 years. He called her at 9 that night, which was morning in Indiana. She picked up on the 4th ring, and there was a car engine behind her, and a radio playing something with a lot of guitar. "You got it," she said. "Not a question. I got it." He waited his second. "Shelby, sole custody, supervised. What am I looking at here?" "You're looking at me being honest for the first time in 11 years. Then be honest." "Fine," he heard a turn signal. "I found a real man, Beck. That's it. That's the whole thing. A man who is actually there, who comes home at 6 and knows the boys' teachers' names and doesn't disappear for a year and come back looking at everybody like he's counting them." Her voice cracked once and then rebuilt itself. Harder. "You want honest?" Ian had a concussion in November. Adam had strep twice. There was a night in February the furnace died and it was 9 degrees, and I sat on the floor of the utility room with a flashlight in my teeth. And you were somewhere doing something you can't tell me about. So no, you don't get to be shocked. I asked you to come with me to Campbell 3 times. And leave my family? For what? There it was. 11 years and 5 words. "Okay," Beck said. "That's it? Okay? I'm on the other side of the planet, Shelby. What would you like me to do from here?" She was quiet, then softer, almost kind, which was worse. "Sign it, Beck. Don't fight it. You'll lose, and it'll cost you money you don't have, and the boys will have to watch." He said okay again, and she hung up, and he sat down on an overturned water crate in the dark and did not move for about 40 minutes, and that would have been the end of it. A sad, ordinary story, one of 10,000 exactly like it in the American military every single year, except that Beck Rutherford, out of 11 years of habit, could not put down a document without reading all of it, including the exhibits. And on page 19, attached in support of the petitioner's request for sole custody and supervised parenting time, was a 4-page neurocognitive evaluation of the respondent, Beckett A. Rutherford, describing impaired executive function, poor impulse control, and significant difficulty with emotional regulation. It was signed by Alec Kavanaugh, Ph.D. It was dated the 9th of April. And on the 9th of April, Beck Rutherford had been in a district capital in the Sahel, sitting on a woven mat in a room with no electricity, drinking tea with a man named Usmain, and writing down the names of everyone who had a claim on a borehole pump. He read the date 4 times. He checked his own notebook. He checked the date on the tea receipt he'd stapled into it, because he stapled everything into it. He checked the manifest of the flight that had put him in that district 2 days earlier. Then he sat very still, in a plywood room, 7,200 miles from home, and felt something in his chest go extremely quiet and extremely clear, the way it did when he finally saw the shape of a village. Somebody had built a version of him out of paper. And somewhere in Pemberton, Indiana, that paperman was already walking around, ahead of him, wearing his name. The first thing he did was nothing, for 9 hours. That was training. In civil affairs, you learn early that the most expensive mistake available to you is reacting to the first thing you find, because the first thing you find is almost never the thing. It's the edge of the thing. You react, you show your face, and the actual structure goes underground for 2 years. So Beck slept badly, got up, ran the morning brief, drove out to a school rehabilitation site, and spent the day doing his job. And while he did it, he ran the problem the way he'd run a district. Fact 1. A document existed describing a clinical examination of him that had not occurred. Fact 2. It was signed by a licensed neuropsychologist who happened to be his brother-in-law. Fact 3. It had been produced, notarized, and filed as a court exhibit by an attorney, which meant at least 3 people had handled it, and none of them had asked the single obvious question. Fact 4, and this was the one that made the back of his neck cold. Nobody makes a forgery like that for one divorce. You don't build a machine to open one door. That evening he went to the Connex, where the section kept its files, and pulled his own paper trail, because the United States Army is many things, but it is above all a machine for generating records. He printed the flight manifest that had moved him from the intermediate staging base on the 7th of April. He printed the daily staff journal entries with his initials on the 9th. He printed the storage log from the network share showing a village assessment file he had saved at 1412 local, which was 7:12 in the morning in Indiana, which was 90 minutes before the appointment time typed at the top of Alec Kavanaugh's evaluation. He put them side by side on a plywood table under a bare bulb and looked at them for a long time. Then he called Ross Naughton. Ross had been his team sergeant on the 2nd deployment, a wiry, chronically amused man from Baton Rouge who had gotten out at 20 years and gone to work as a special agent for the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, which is the arm that investigates fraud committed against the Department of Defense. They talked twice a year. Beck had never once asked him for anything. He laid it out in about 4 minutes, flat, no adjectives. Ross didn't say anything for a while. Beck could hear him breathing and typing. "Beck," he said finally, "I need you to listen to me very carefully, because what you do in the next month decides whether this ends with you getting your kids back or with you being the guy who blew it. Go." If a licensed provider signed an evaluation for a patient who was not physically present in the country, that is not a family court problem. Depending on who paid for it, that's healthcare fraud. If it was billed to TRICARE or to the VA, it's federal healthcare fraud. And if it was manufactured specifically to be used as evidence in a custody proceeding, it's also a scheme, and schemes have volume. A pause. You said 9 locations? 9. Then I want you to do exactly 2 things and no others. 1. Don't tell your lawyer, your mother, your first sergeant, or your wife that you noticed the date. Not one word. The second they know you can count, that document disappears and gets replaced with a clean one, dated a week you were home, and then you're a crazy man with a conspiracy theory who lost his kids. Beck closed his eyes. And 2? 2. You keep doing what you already do. You write it down. Everything. Dates, names, who said what, who was in the room. But Beck, don't go get anything. Don't call the clinic. Don't drive past it. Don't put your hands on a single piece of paper you're not legally entitled to. You collect what falls in your lap and nothing else. Ross exhaled. Let it grow, brother. Right now you've got one document. In 6 months, if I'm right about what this is, you'll have 400. 6 months? Beck said. I know. They're taking my sons in 6 months. They're taking your sons in 3 weeks, Ross said. And there is not one thing on God's earth you can do about that from Africa. What you can decide is whether they keep them. Beck sat with that. He thought about a district he'd worked in on his second tour, where a man had controlled 11 villages for a decade with a single ledger of debts, and how the thing that finally broke him wasn't a raid. It was that Beck's section had spent 5 months quietly photographing the ledger, page by page, until the elders could see the whole shape of it at once, and then all 11 villages had understood on the same afternoon that they had been robbed by the same hand. You don't win that fight by being angry in month 1. You win it by being patient enough that everyone gets to be angry on the same day. Okay, Beck said. Let it grow. He hung up, and he took out a fresh green notebook, and on the first line of the first page he wrote the date, and under it he wrote Pemberton. Then he drew a small square, and inside the square he wrote a name he had said at a wedding toast 11 years earlier. Howard. He came home in September to a house that had been redecorated. That was the detail that got him, standing in the front hall with a duffel on his shoulder. Not the missing furniture, the new curtains. Somebody had chosen fabric. He was allowed in the house because the temporary orders hadn't been entered yet, which was a technicality that lasted 9 days. During those 9 days, he learned the following things. Shelby had moved in with a man named Brian Tarrant. Brian Tarrant was 41, a partner at Tarrant and Pierpont, the largest family law practice in 3 counties, and the attorney of record on Shelby's divorce petition. He had a jaw, a boat, and a billboard on the state highway, with his face on it, and the words, "The end of one thing is the start of another." He had also, Beck learned from a court clerk who was chatty and had no idea she was being surveyed, handled somewhere north of 80% of the contested military custody cases in the county over the previous 6 years. Beck wrote that number in the notebook and did not react to it. Ian was polite to him. That was the worst part. 11 years old, a kid who used to run at him from 30 feet out, now shaking his hand in a driveway like a small adult at a funeral. Adam still climbed him like a tree, but on the second day Adam said, out of nowhere, in the specific sing-song of a child repeating something, "You get confused sometimes. That's why we can't be alone with you." Beck put him down gently and crouched to his eye level and said, "Who told you that, bud?" Adam's face closed like a door. 7 years old, and he already knew the question was dangerous. Beck stood up and walked out to the driveway and stood there in the September heat with his hands on top of his head again. Then he went inside, got his notebook, and wrote down the sentence exactly as the boy had said it, with the time and the date and the room. The temporary orders hearing was 11 minutes long. Beck sat next to a family law attorney named Catherine Broward, a blunt, tired, deeply competent woman from 2 towns over, who had told him honestly in their first meeting that this was going to be ugly and that he should prepare himself. Across the aisle sat Shelby, Brian Tarrant, and, in the first row of the gallery, Howard and Gloria Kavanaugh, Alec, and Todd, the whole family, on a Tuesday morning, for an 11-minute hearing. They didn't need to be there. That was the thing Beck noticed and filed. They wanted to be there. Tarrant handed up the evaluation. Catherine objected to it on foundation and got overruled, because in a temporary orders hearing, a judge takes what's in front of him and moves on. There was also a report from a guardian ad litem, a woman named Dr. Pamela Kessinger, who had spoken to Beck for exactly 19 minutes in a conference room and to the boys for 2 hours in a house Shelby had chosen. Her report used the phrase functionally absent parent 4 times. The judge, a heavy, unhurried man named Clifford Stapleton, who had been on that bench for 22 years, read for a minute, asked Beck 3 questions, and entered temporary orders granting Shelby sole legal and physical custody with supervised parenting time for Beck of 4 hours every other Saturday at a facility called the Family Bridge Center, which charged $65 an hour and was, Beck would learn 8 months later, a limited liability company whose registered agent was Tarrant and Pierpont. As the gallery stood up, Beck heard Todd Kavanaugh say something in a low voice, and he heard Howard laugh, not cruelly, comfortably. The laugh of a man who has watched the same movie 40 times and still enjoys the part where it works. Beck turned around, and for about 2 seconds he looked at his father-in-law across a courtroom, and Howard Kavanaugh looked back at him with real, uncomplicated pity. "It's not personal, son," Howard said. "You were never going to be able to keep up." Beck waited his full second. "No," he said. "I don't suppose I was." Then he walked out, drove 11 miles to a diner off the state highway, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and wrote for 2 hours and 10 minutes. Here is how you survey a district. You do not start with the powerful man. You start with the people at the edges who have already been ruined, because ruined people have nothing left to protect and excellent memories. You find them by looking for a pattern in the wreckage, and then you go stand in the wreckage and wait to be talked to. Beck's wreckage was a bulletin board in the hallway outside courtroom 2. County courts post their calendars. Anyone can read them. Beck started going on Thursdays, which was the family docket, and he sat on a bench in that hallway with a paperback he never turned a page of, and he wrote down names. Just the names: petitioner, respondent, attorney. It took him 5 weeks to see it, and when he saw it he had to go outside and walk around the parking lot twice. Tarrant and Pierpont was on one side of a stunning number of those cases. Fine. Biggest firm in 3 counties. But there was a subset inside that subset. Cases where the respondent's name was followed, in the clerk's shorthand, by a small notation for active duty or veteran status. And in every single one of those, filed in support of the custody request, there was an evaluation. Beck couldn't see the evaluations. Family files are sealed, but the docket sheets are not. And a docket sheet lists exhibits by title, and the title was always the same: Neurocognitive and Behavioral Fitness Panel, Clearview Cognitive. He counted 41 of them in the preceding 4 years, in one county. He wrote the number in the notebook, and then he sat in his truck for a while with his hands on the wheel. Then he did the second thing you do in a district survey. He went and found the ruined. Craig Winfield was a staff sergeant, medically retired, who worked the parts counter at a farm equipment dealership out on Route 9 and had a daughter named Rosie he saw 12 days a year. Beck bought a hydraulic fitting he didn't need and asked him a question about a hose, and 40 minutes later, Craig Winfield was standing behind that counter with his jaw working, telling a stranger about an appointment he was sure he had never attended. "I said that in court," Craig said. "I said, I never went there. I never sat in that room." "What'd the judge say?" "He said the doctor's a licensed provider, and I'm a man with a documented anger problem." Craig laughed, one flat syllable, which by then, buddy, I did have one. Beck asked him one more question. "Who was your lawyer?" Craig said a name. Then he said, "Everybody's lawyer's the same guy around here. He's the only one who'll take these." Over the following 4 months, Beck Rutherford found 9 more. He never once asked them for a document. That was Ross's rule, and Beck kept it like scripture. He asked them what happened, and he wrote it down. A retired chief warrant officer in Delphi who'd lost his son at 14 and hadn't spoken to him since. A National Guard medic named Angela who'd been evaluated as unstable 7 weeks after returning from a mobilization and had spent the 2 years since driving to a supervised visitation center to sit in a beige room with her own daughter and a stranger with a clipboard. A 26-year-old who had gotten out after 1 enlistment and had signed away his rights entirely, because Tarrant had explained to him, kindly, in a conference room, that fighting it would cost $80,000 he didn't have and he'd lose anyway. 9 people. 9 kitchens and parts counters and break rooms. 9 versions of the same shape. And on Saturday mornings, every other week, Beck drove to the Family Bridge Center and paid $260 to spend 4 hours with his sons in a room with a 2-way mirror and a bin of toys for younger children, under the supervision of a 19-year-old who was studying to be a dental hygienist. He never complained about it, not once, not to anyone. He brought a deck of cards and taught Ian gin rummy. He let Adam beat him at a magnetic fishing game 40 times in a row. When Ian, in month 5, finally asked him the question he had clearly been carrying for a long time. "Dad, is it true you got hurt in your head?" Beck said, "No, bud. But I understand why you'd think that. And I'm not going to ask you to call your mom a liar. Let's play cards. Ian looked at him for a long moment with his mother's exact eyes. Then he said, "Okay," and dealt. Beck went out to his truck afterward and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes before he could drive. That night he wrote in the notebook, he asked, which means he is still looking. Do not spend that. The thing about a machine that runs on paper is that somebody has to do the scheduling. Erin Halcomb was 23 years old and had worked the front desk at the Clearview Cognitive location on Fairmont Avenue for 2 years and 4 months. She was good at her job in the way that certain young people are good at unglamorous jobs, which is to say completely, and with a horror of things being wrong. She built the master schedule. She knew which rooms were booked. She knew that Dr. Alec Kavanaugh's calendar showed him in room 3 on the 9th of April with a patient named Rutherford, and she also knew, because she had been the one to move it, that Dr. Alec Kavanaugh had been in Scottsdale that entire week at a conference. She asked about it once, in November, in an email, politely, with a screenshot. Her supervisor told her the panel scheduling was handled at the corporate level and she should not be looking at provider calendars. She asked again in January, after she noticed that room 3 at the Fairmont location had, on the 11th of that month, hosted 14 separate 90-minute evaluations between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. 14 90-minute appointments is 21 hours of work in a 9-hour day, in one room. 9 days later, Erin Halcomb was terminated for a violation of the patient privacy policy. She was walked out by Todd Kavanaugh personally, and in the parking lot he told her, with a friendly hand on her car door, that Pemberton was a small town and that she'd want to be careful what she said about a family that had put half of it through school. That was in February. In April, on a Thursday, Erin Halcomb walked into the diner off the state highway, where a large, quiet man had been eating breakfast alone every Thursday for 4 months, and stood at the end of his booth and said, "You're Rutherford." Beck put his fork down. He waited his second. "I am. My name is Erin Halcomb. I need to know something before I sit down." Her hands were shaking and her voice was not. "If I sit down, are you going to use me to get your kids back? Or are you going to do this right?" Beck thought about that honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, and because he'd learned in 11 years that the fastest way to lose a source is to promise them the thing they want to hear. "Both," he said, "but in that order? No, right first, because if I go grab my kids with it, they'll bury it in a family court file and seal it, and every other person it happened to stays buried with it." He moved the coffee cup aside. "There's a federal agent in Indianapolis who's been waiting 11 months for somebody exactly like you. I'll drive you there myself, and I will not be in the room." Erin Halcomb sat down. She had not taken a single patient file. She was too careful and too frightened for that. What she had, on a personal laptop, were 3 years of scheduling exports, the room booking data she'd built herself, that lived in a facilities system nobody thought of as medical records, that she had legitimately downloaded every month as part of her job to reconcile the cleaning contractor's invoices. Room, date, start time, end time, provider, no patient names at all. Which meant she had brought Beck Rutherford, without ever knowing it, the only thing he actually needed, a complete, contemporaneous, independent record of when every room in 9 buildings had physically been occupied. Ross Naughton called him back at 11 that night, and for the first time in 11 months, Ross did not sound amused. "Beck," he said, "say the number again." 406 panels billed in that window. Her room data can only account for 131 of them physically happening. There was a long silence on the line. "Don't do anything," Ross said. "Don't do anything at all. I have to make a phone call to a United States attorney." What happened over the next 14 months was, by design, the most boring period of Beck Rutherford's life. Federal fraud cases are not built in raids. They are built by accountants, a joint team formed out of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General, and the FBI's Indianapolis Field Office, working under an assistant United States attorney named Monica Hollenbeck. And the first thing they did was tell Beck Rutherford to go away. That was fine. That was correct. He had done the survey. Now the people with subpoena power did the arithmetic. What they found, over 400 days, was this. Clearview Cognitive had two businesses. The first was real, 9 clinics doing legitimate neuropsychological work, employing 160 people, well-reviewed, competently run. The second, business lived inside the first, like a wasp in a fig. It worked like this. Todd Kavanaugh's job, the golf and the steak dinners, was a referral pipeline. Family law firms across 4 counties sent Clearview a specific kind of client, the parent with money, in a custody fight, against a parent who was deployed, mobilized, or recently separated from service. Clearview would produce a neurocognitive and behavioral fitness panel on the other parent. Sometimes that parent actually attended and got a real evaluation, and the findings were shaded. More often, 406 times in the window Aaron Halcom's room data covered, of which 275 had no physical appointment behind them at all. The panel was simply written. There was a template. The investigators found it on a shared drive, a Word document with bracketed fields, and the bracketed fields were the TEL, service member last name, deployment count, and a drop-down of 11 pre-written impairment narratives with clinical shorthand names like executive dysfunction moderate and impulse control severe. Alec Kavanaugh signed them, all of them, 406, and the money came from 3 directions at once, which was the elegance of it and the reason it had run for 9 years. Clearview billed TRICARE and the VA for the evaluations, at $1,100 to $2,200 apiece. The family law firms paid a referral arrangement dressed as a marketing services agreement, and the winning parent paid, and paid, and paid, for the supervised visitation center that Tarrant and Pierpont owned, for the follow-up panels, for the annual re-evaluations that every one of those custody orders required. 9 years, 640 custody orders in 4 counties with a Clearview panel in the file. 640 children. Monica Hollenbeck's team took it to a grand jury in the spring, and that was where they hit the problem that made all of them, eventually, look at a master sergeant's calendar. The problem was simple. There were 11 people to arrest, and they were never in the same place. Howard Kavanaugh spent a third of the year in Arizona. Alec traveled constantly. Todd was in and out of 4 counties. Brian Tarrant had a boat, a passport, a Cayman-registered holding company, and, this was the part that made the FBI nervous, a client base full of people who would call him the instant anything moved. And the records that mattered lived on servers at 4 separate sites, which meant 4 simultaneous warrants, which meant that if anybody got 30 minutes of warning, a 9-year paper trail became a very expensive pile of nothing. They needed a date, one date, when all 11 of them would be sitting in one room, unarmed, unwarned, without their phones, in a building with a metal detector at the only public entrance, and with a Marshall-friendly floor plan. Monica Hollenbeck looked up from her legal pad. "My final custody hearing is the 12th of June, Beck said. Courtroom 2, Merrill County. They will all be there, all of them. They came to an 11-minute temporary hearing. They will absolutely come to the day they finish me." "You're sure?" "Ma'am, they're not coming for the evidence. They've never once needed the evidence." He waited his second. "They're coming to watch." There was a long pause in that room. "There is a cost to you," Hollenbeck said carefully. "If we take that date, then between now and June, you have to lose. Publicly, convincingly. You cannot file the motion that would blow this up, and you cannot let your own attorney file it either. And you have to sit through every hearing between now and then and take it. And if anything goes wrong on the 12th, you will have handed them 14 months of unopposed record." "I understand. Do you? Your ex-wife is going to say things about you on that stand. She's been saying them for 2 years. Your sons may be interviewed again." Beck's jaw moved once. "Then let's not get it wrong." So he lost, on purpose, for 11 more weeks. He lost a motion to modify parenting time in March. He lost a motion to compel discovery in April, when Catherine Broward, who had no idea, and who Beck would later spend a long evening apologizing to, argued herself hoarse and got nothing. He sat in a mediation in May where Brian Tarrant slid a proposed decree across a table and explained, in the reasonable voice of a man doing you a favor, that Beck could keep his truck and his tools and 40% of his retirement if he'd agree to termination of his parental rights, and wouldn't that be cleaner for everyone, especially the boys? Beck read all 11 pages. He waited his second. "No," he said, "but thank you for putting it in writing." Terrence smiled the way men smile when they have decided you are stupid. 3 weeks before the hearing, Ross Naughton drove down and the two of them sat on Beck's tailgate at the end of a gravel road, and Ross handed him a single sealed manila envelope, 9 by 12, unmarked. "You will not open this," Ross said. "It doesn't have anything in it that you're allowed to know the details of. It's got the certified order. It's got a cover letter from Hollenbeck, and it's got one exhibit. You hand it to the judge and you say nothing else. Not one word of explanation. Understand me. If you argue, you contaminate it." Beck turned it over in his hands. It weighed almost nothing. 14 months, he said. 14 months. Ross looked out at the field. "Beck, you know this is going to be the worst morning of your life before it's the best one, right? You have to sit there and let her finish." "I know. You can still take a deal. Hollenbeck would sign off. You'd get the boys back in 90 days quiet. No cameras." Beck watched the wind move across the beans for a while. "There's a woman named Angela," he said. "National Guard medic. She's been driving 40 minutes each way to sit in a beige room with her own daughter for 2 years, and she believes it's her fault, because a doctor wrote down that it is." He put the envelope inside his jacket. 90 days quiet doesn't get her out of that room. The 12th of June was a Thursday, and it was already 84 degrees at 9 in the morning. Courtroom 2 of the Merrow County Courthouse is a high, dim, wood-paneled room with 12 rows of gallery benches and a ceiling fan that has needed a bearing since 2011. Beck arrived at 8:40 in his service dress uniform because Catherine had asked him to, and sat down at the respondent's table and did not look behind him. They filled the front row at 8:52. Howard and Gloria Kavanaugh, Alec, in a blazer, looking at his phone, Todd, who had brought a coffee, 2 aunts, a cousin, Shelby's best friend from high school, 11 people in the first 2 rows of the gallery of a custody hearing, dressed like they were going to lunch afterward, which they were. Todd had made the reservation on his phone at 8:55, and a marshal in a maintenance uniform standing at the back of the room noted the time. Beck heard them behind him for 2 hours. He heard Todd say something about how long the fan had needed fixing. He heard a woman laugh at something Gloria said. At one point, during a sidebar, he heard Howard Kavanaugh say the words, "Hand him a broom," and heard 4 people find it funny. He did not turn around. He kept his hands flat on the table. Shelby testified for 50 minutes. She was good. That was the thing nobody ever understood about her. She wasn't shrill and she didn't overreach. She cried once, briefly, at an honest place, describing the February the furnace died, and Beck, listening, knew she meant that part, and it went through him like a nail. She said he was a stranger in his own house. She said the boys flinched at loud noises when he was home. She said, with real sorrow, that she had spent 11 years covering for a man who came back a little further away each time, and that she had finally accepted, with the help of professionals, that the man she married was not coming back, and that her responsibility now was to her children. Brian Tarrant stood for his closing at 11:14. He walked the judge through the exhibits, the panel, the guardian ad litem's report, the 4-hour supervised visits, and the notation. Beck had wondered when this would come, that the respondent had never once requested an increase in parenting time in 22 months, which Tarrant offered as evidence of a man who had, in his heart, already left. Then Tarrant turned and looked at Beck across the courtroom and delivered the sentence he had clearly been polishing for a week. "Your Honor, we can dress this up in ranks and ribbons if we want to, but strip the uniform off it, and here is the truth of this case. This man is a stranger to his own sons. He has been for years. All my client is asking this court to do is stop pretending otherwise." The front row made a sound, not a laugh exactly, a sort of collective, satisfied exhale. Judge Clifford Stapleton wrote something. Then he took off his reading glasses and looked down at the respondent's table. "Mr. Rutherford, anything you'd like to add before I rule?" Catherine Broward leaned toward Beck with her hand over the microphone and started to say no. Beck stood up. He reached inside his jacket and took out a plain sealed manila envelope, and he walked to the bench, and he set it down on the judge's desk. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "That." Then he walked back and sat down and folded his hands. Tarrant was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. We have received no notice of any exhibit." And Judge Stapleton, who was already slitting the envelope with a letter opener, said, "Sit down, counsel," without looking up. The ceiling fan turned. Somebody in the back row coughed. Judge Stapleton read the cover letter. His face did nothing at all. Then he read the second page, and turned it, and read the third page, and stopped. He was a heavy man with a red complexion, and everyone in that courtroom watched the color go out of it, from the jaw upward, like water draining from a glass. He set the page down very carefully, as though it were hot. He looked up, not at Beck, past Beck, at the first 2 rows of the gallery, at 11 people in good clothes with a lunch reservation, and he looked at them for 4 full seconds. Then Judge Clifford Stapleton leaned into his microphone, and in a voice that came out flat and strange, and much too loud in that quiet room, he said, "Bailiff, lock the doors. Nobody leaves this room." For a second and a half, nothing happened, because nobody in that room believed they had heard it. Then Bailiff Ray Hollifield, 58 years old, 26 years in that building, walked to the double doors at the back of courtroom 2 and turned the deadbolt, and the sound of that bolt going over was the loudest thing that had happened in Merrow County in a decade. Brian Tarrant stood up. He had not read anything. He didn't need to. He had spent 9 years being the man who knew what was in envelopes, and the single most useful skill he possessed was recognizing, faster than anyone else in a room, the exact moment a thing had ended. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was pleasant. It was almost normal. "I'd ask to be excused from this case. Effective immediately. I have a conflict." "Sit down, Mr. Tarrant." "Your Honor, I don't believe I can ethically continue to—" "Mr. Tarrant." Judge Stapleton did not raise his voice at all. "The order in my hand identifies you by name. Sit down." Tarrant sat down. There were 9 men and 2 women in that courtroom that morning who had come in through the public entrance as spectators and had not been spectators at all. A woman in a cardigan in the 4th row, a maintenance man, 2 people who had been reading paperbacks in the back since 8:15. They stood up in an order that had been rehearsed in a hotel conference room in Indianapolis 2 nights earlier, and the front 2 rows of the gallery of a family court in Pemberton, Indiana, were, over the next 11 minutes, placed under arrest one at a time. Howard Kavanaugh was last, on purpose. He stood up when they came for him and said, loudly, that he wanted everyone to be very clear about who they were putting their hands on, and that this was a mistake that a number of people were going to spend the rest of their careers regretting. Beck did not turn around. He had promised himself that. He sat at the respondent's table with his hands flat and his eyes on the grain of the wood, and he listened to his father-in-law be walked out of a room. Shelby was arrested at the petitioner's table. She was still holding a tissue. She looked at Beck once, across 8 feet of courtroom, with an expression he had never seen on her face in 11 years of marriage, which was the look of a person doing arithmetic and getting an answer for the first time. "How long?" she said. Beck waited his second. "Since the 9th of April, he said. 2 years ago." She started to say something, and stopped, and a federal agent took her elbow, and that was the last conversation Beck Rutherford ever had with his wife outside of a courtroom. Judge Clifford Stapleton did not rule on custody that day. What he did instead, at 11:52 in the morning, was something that no one who was in that room has ever stopped talking about. He asked the clerk to note that the court was suspending the proceeding on its own motion. Then he said, on the record, that he had signed orders in this building for 22 years, and that if what was in his hand was true, then he had personally signed a substantial number of them on the strength of a document that was manufactured, and that he intended to find out how many, and that he would be requesting the assignment of an outside judge to review every one of them. He also said, and this is the part Beck kept, that in 22 years no one had ever handed him a sealed envelope, and that he wanted the record to reflect that the respondent had sat in his courtroom for 2 hours and had not said a single word in his own defense while it was being done to him, and that the court had drawn conclusions about the respondent from his silence, and that those conclusions had been wrong. The federal case took 19 months. It was not a dramatic trial, because there was almost nothing to argue about. The government had 406 panels, a template document with drop-down menus, 3 years of room booking data, a 9-year billing history, and, after the 3rd week, Todd Kavanaugh, who cooperated fully and early and in exhaustive detail, because Todd had been afraid of his father his entire life and had, it turned out, been keeping his own copies of everything since 2019 for exactly this reason. Alec Kavanaugh surrendered his license and pleaded guilty to healthcare fraud and to falsifying records in a federal investigation. He was sentenced to 11 years. At his sentencing, he read a statement in which he said he had signed the first one in 2016 because his father asked him to, and he had not been able to find the day, in the 9 years since, on which stopping would have been possible. Judge Hollenbeck's colleague on the bench told him that day, before imposing sentence, that the day had been every day. Howard Kavanaugh went to trial and lost in 4 hours of jury deliberation, 22 years. He was 69 when the verdict came in. He has, according to a reporter who covered it, never once in any interview used the word children. Brian Tarrant was disbarred, convicted on conspiracy and honest services counts, and sentenced to 14 years. The supervised visitation center closed. The billboard on the state highway came down in November and stayed blank until spring. Gloria Kavanaugh pleaded to a misdemeanor and got probation. Dr. Pamela Kessinger, the guardian ad litem, was stricken from the state's registry after an inquiry established that she had received 41 referrals from a single firm and had never once, in 6 years, recommended against that firm's client. Shelby Kavanaugh pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and to obstruction, and was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months. She had known since 2018. She had brought her husband's name to her brother herself in the 2nd week of a deployment because her father had told her that if she was going to do it, she should do it while Beck was gone and could not be examined. That was the sentence that Beck read 4 times, in a transcript, sitting in his truck. He got his sons back on a Tuesday in October, 4 months after the doors were locked. It was not a scene. It was a family court hearing that took 19 minutes, in front of the outside judge, in an almost empty room. Ian was 12 by then, and Adam was 8. They came out to the truck with 2 duffel bags and a plastic bin of Legos, and Adam talked for the entire 11-mile drive without stopping once, and Ian did not say anything at all until they were pulling into the driveway of a house with the wrong curtains in it. Then Ian said, "You knew the whole time. At the fishing game. You knew the whole time. At the fishing game. You knew." Beck turned off the engine. "I did. Why didn't you tell me?" And Beck Rutherford, who had spent 14 months being the most patient man in Indiana, turned in his seat and told his son the truth, which was, "Because you were 11, and if I'd told you, you'd have had to carry it, and you'd have had to lie to your mom every day, and that would have been me, putting my fight on a kid. My job was to carry it. Your job was to be 11. He put his hand on the back of his son's neck. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'd do it the same way again." Ian cried then, for a long time, and Adam got scared and cried too. And the 3 of them sat in a truck in a driveway for 20 minutes. And then they went inside and ordered a truly irresponsible amount of pizza. The review of the custody orders is still going. They call it the Merrow County Review in the filings, but around the courthouse everybody calls it the Rutherford Review, which Beck hates. 640 files. As of last spring, 211 had been reopened, 94 custody arrangements had been modified, and 41 parents who had been ordered into supervised visitation on the strength of an evaluation that never happened had that order vacated outright. One of them was a National Guard medic named Angela, who got unsupervised weekends with her daughter for the first time in 4 years, and who wrote Beck a letter he keeps in a drawer and does not read very often because he can't. One of them was a parts counterman named Craig Winfield, who took his daughter Rosie to the state fair. Aaron Halcomb testified for 2 days and now works in compliance at a hospital system 3 hours away and has been promoted twice. Beck retired at 22 years. He works for the county now, of all things, doing something that everybody agrees is unglamorous and that he seems to find deeply satisfying. He audits records, deeds, permits, contracts, chain of custody. He sits in a small office with good light and he reads paper for a living. And about once a month he finds something that is not right, and he writes it down in a green notebook, and then he goes and does the next thing. On the wall of that office, framed, is not a medal. It is a photograph he took himself, badly, of a hand-drawn map from a district survey in 2019. A page of squares and names and arrows showing who owed what to whom in a village of 400 people. He tells his sons the same thing his father told him, and he makes them repeat it back, and they groan every time. Paper outlives people. So be careful what you write down, and be very careful who you let write about you. Nathan again. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to walk away from that story thinking the lesson is, get a good lawyer, and it isn't. Catherine Broward was a good lawyer. She lost every motion she filed for 2 years, and she lost them fairly, because the system in front of her was doing exactly what it was designed to do with the information it had been given. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. Nobody in that courthouse was cartoonishly evil. The judge wasn't bought. The guardian ad litem probably told herself she was protecting children. The system worked perfectly. It was just being fed. Here's what I actually take from Beck Rutherford. First, the most dangerous person in any conflict is not the loudest one. It's the one who gets to write the record and knows you won't read it. Read it. All of it. The exhibits, the dates, the boring pages at the back. That is where people hide, because they are counting on your exhaustion. Second, and this one's harder, he had the truth in month 1, and he sat on it for 14 months, and that is the single most disciplined thing in this entire story. Most of us, holding proof we've been lied about, would have set it on fire in the first week just to feel something. He understood that being right immediately would have bought him one small private win, and that being right slowly would empty 100 beige rooms. And third, for anybody in the middle of something like this right now, write it down. Times, dates, exact words, who was in the room. Not because you're planning revenge, because memory is soft and paper is hard, and one day somebody may hand a version of you to a judge, and the only thing that beats a document is a better document. If this one hit you, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.